What's going on, guys? It's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this video we're going to take a look at installing an Exedy twin disc clutch in our EVO. So as I continue to document everything I'm doing on my EVO, I tried to make this step-by-step video, how-to video here of removing my old single disc clutch and replacing it with this Exedy twin disc clutch and putting this in. So I made this how-to video just kind of walking through all the steps. And if you've watched my other videos, you know that I already changed the rear main seal, and I'm also putting in an ACT monoloc collar. So I didn't include the how-tos in this video for those steps, since I've already created videos on those, and I will link to those videos in the video description as well if you want to reference those. So this video is just about removing my old clutch and installing the new clutch. It's not about putting the transmission in place. I will create that video soon, and depending on when you're watching this, maybe it's already created. So again, Boosted Films on YouTube, check there for other videos if this isn't the exact video you're looking for. So that's it for this introduction. Now we'll get into the video. So the first thing we're going to do here is obviously unbolt our old clutch. And we're going to do that by removing the bolts that hold on our pressure plate, which holds the clutch in place. Those bolts shouldn't be too tight. You should be able to get them free without too much trouble. And the clutch we're removing from this car is an ACT clutch. It's a single disc and it is a full face sprung disc, and that's what we're removing, and we will be replacing it with an Exedy twin disc clutch. So once that old clutch is out of the way, we're going to remove the bolts that hold on the flywheel. Now, a warning about these bolts that hold the flywheel on: they're going to be pretty tight. They should be torqued almost to 100 foot-pounds. So if you don't have an impact available, you might have to do something to hold your engine and keep it from spinning over. And you also want to make sure that that socket that you use, that you put on those bolts, you want to make sure that that lays flat and that's on there flush, because otherwise you might end up stripping the bolts, and that would cause you huge problems in the future. So you want to make sure that socket is on the bolt properly before you start twisting and prying too hard, if those bolts are really hard to break loose. And again, if you need to keep your motor from spinning over because you don't have access to impacts, you can see what I set up here, just kind of putting in a bolt in where the bell housing goes, and then putting one of our pressure plate screws back in and putting that on the flywheel, and then you should be able to set up something to hold that flywheel to keep it from spinning if that's an issue you're having. So once we have removed all those bolts, our flywheel should be able to come free off of the crank. The flywheel is going to be rather heavy, so just be ready for that when you pull it off. And next, I'm just showing what it looked like when I pulled my flywheel off. If you've watched my previous videos, you know that I also changed that starter plate and I changed that rear main seal while I was doing this. So here's the jump cut to the new shiny items that I installed. If you want to see how I did that, please check out my other how-to videos, and I will also include a link in the description of this video so you can see it there as well. So here you can see our old clutch out and our new Exedy twin disc that's ready to go in. And another video that I already made and that I highly recommend is getting a monoloc collar from ACT. That collar should help prevent any pop-outs from your throwout bearing. And really, if you're spending the money on a twin disc clutch, you should be able to spend a little bit extra, and I'd recommend getting this monoloc collar. So if you need to know how to install the monoloc collar as well, I have a how-to video on that, and I'll include that video in the description as well. So here we are with our Exedy twin disc clutch, and the first thing we're going to do is disassemble the clutch, basically because we need to bolt on our flywheel first before we can do anything else. This Exedy twin disc clutch does come with its own flywheel that needs to be used with this clutch. It's a whole assembly, flywheel and everything. So if you are installing a twin disc clutch, you're going to be able to get rid of your old flywheel and your old clutch. Now this clutch will come all assembled and bolted together. So these bolts holding this pressure plate on, this purple plate here, basically those are going to be torqued. They're going to be tighter, so you're going to have to break those loose. And just a heads up about this clutch, there are bolts on the back of the flywheel that kind of hold this step in place. They hold this step onto the flywheel itself. You'll see a little bit more about what I mean in a bit by a step. But when you are disassembling your clutch, you don't want to touch those bolts on the back. At least if you bought a brand new clutch, you shouldn't have to loosen up those bolts from the back side of the flywheel. you'll just want to remove those hex bolts from the front of that pressure plate. And obviously, if you've never worked with a twin disc before, I recommend maybe taking some photos of it as you take it apart in case you are worried about mixing it up, although you should be able to reference my video here as well to see exactly how things go back together. And you also certainly want to note that blue line on the side of the clutch itself. That blue line is something you're going to want to pay attention to, and even as we clean up our parts, we want to make sure we kind of know where that blue line is. So when you're bolting it onto the car, you're going to want to line up that blue line again. And we'll get into that in greater detail once we actually do install this clutch. So I mentioned cleaning up some parts. I have these flywheel bolts that I bought brand new about 3,000 miles ago, so they are in really good shape. So these OEM flywheel bolts, I'm just cleaning them up a little bit and getting them ready to be installed. If you need the torque specs, your clutch should have came with a torque spec sheet, but basically for our purposes on our EVO, we're going to torque the flywheel bolts to 99 foot-pounds, and we'll be torquing the pressure plate bolts to 23 foot-pounds. So now we're going to work our way under the car and set our flywheel onto the crank. It should basically only go on one way. There is a hole where a guide pin or a dowel pin would go that should line up with your flywheel and on your crankshaft. And then just to hold this in place, I did just put a bolt in temporarily. And before I get into the Loctite discussion, I just kind of want to say there are different ways you can do this. People have different preferences on what is right. I will just say that the main purpose of using some Loctite here is just to prevent your flywheel bolts from backing out on their own. Obviously, that's something you don't want to happen. So that's why a lot of people use Loctite. But there are different strengths of Loctite. There are different issues you can run into if you run too much Loctite. So basically, from the research I did and what I gathered, the best option to me seemed to be to run red Loctite, but use it very sparingly. So I only applied 1 or 2 drops on the flywheel bolts of red Loctite. So I didn't want to over apply. I didn't want to run it all the way around. I basically put 1 drop on each side. If you used a weaker Loctite, like a blue, you might want to use a little bit more, but I'll let you do your own research on that. I'm just letting you know for my purposes here, I basically put 1 or 2 drops, just a little bit on each bolt before I installed my flywheel bolts. And something I often forget to mention, but I want to mention here, and hopefully you see me do this in some of my other videos, is when you torque something in place initially and when you do torque it to spec, what you want to do is what people often call star pattern. So you'll want to tighten one bolt, and then when you move on to the next bolt, you'll want to go to a bolt that's directly across from it. And there are different options for bolts that are directly across from it, but basically what you want to do is prevent it from getting crooked as you tighten it up. So a challenge you can run into here is basically that you have to torque these bolts so tight that your engine is certainly going to want to spin over. So there are 2 different options I kind of tried to hold this in place. The first one you can see here is just basically placing a hammer kind of between the subframe and the step of that flywheel to hold it in place. I found this didn't work as well, I think maybe because the hammer was flexing a little bit. So this didn't work optimally for me, but maybe that'll work for you, just an option. What did work better for me is to use one of those bell housing bolts again, and I put in a bolt that kind of had a hook on it, and then I placed my wrench. As you can see here, my wrench held it in place. And with this setup, I was able to torque my flywheel bolts to 99 foot-pounds. And you're going to want to torque these flywheel bolts in 3 different stages. The first stage, I recommend torquing them to 30 foot-pounds, then torque them to 60 foot-pounds, and finally do your 99 foot-pounds. And of course, a lot like when you were removing these bolts, you want to be careful when you're torquing these. You want to make sure that you have your socket flat, on those bolts, because you don't want to end up rounding them off. You can potentially round them off even while you're tightening them, or at least partially round them off, and then you're making trouble for yourself the next time you might have to remove these bolts. That's also why I preach kind of using a limited amount or a small amount of that red Loctite, because if you did use too much, potentially red Loctite is really made to need heat to be removed. And you don't always want to have to use a torch to remove your flywheel bolts, if the next time you want to change your clutch or change your flywheel. So that's why I would just use a little bit of red Loctite on those bolts, just to kind of hopefully keep them from ever spinning out on their own, but you still want to be able to break them loose next time if you're working on the car. So here you can see our flywheel is bolted in place. So now I'm going to run through installing the actual clutch components now that we have the flywheel torqued in place. So there are 2 discs in this clutch, obviously, hence a twin disc setup. And I'm going to point out the markings here on the disc so you know exactly what they mean. Basically, this first disc here has F/W side and then T/M side. Now what that means, the F/W means that is the flywheel disc. So that means this disc is the first one we're going to want to put on because it's going to want to be closest to the flywheel. And the TM means transmission side. So basically that's so you know which way these discs go in. So TM means the letters TM should be facing the transmission. So again, the FW on this disc means it's the disc we're bolting to the flywheel, and the TM means that's the side of the disc that we want facing the transmission. If you flip this disc around in my hand, you would not see the TM side markings. And before we're going to set that disc in place, we're going to just clean up our intermediate plate, also known as a floater plate. We're going to clean that up with some brake clean. So I did that off camera just because I wasn't going to keep moving the camera since I was doing this by myself. But know that off camera I sprayed this with brake clean before I put it on. And you should be able to do that with all these other components other than the disc themselves. You do not want to spray the 2 clutch discs with any brake clean. And another item of note here, what I've heard, at least for balancing issues, is you'll know that I had the notch that's in the disc. I'm trying to get that notch basically straight up. And then you'll also see that I still have the blue line on these components, so I can line them up as well when I put them in place, and I know I'm putting them back where they should be. And basically you can see right here, this kind of notch. That's basically just confirming that that notch out of that particular disc is kind of straight up. And what we're going to want to do with the next disc that we put in is we're going to want to kind of do the opposite. We're going to want to make sure that that disc isn't straight up. So again, taking some brake clean, cleaning our components, but also paying attention to where that blue line is. So now you do only have 1 disc left, so it should be the correct one. But again, checking the markings on this disc. This disc is going to say T/M side disc and T/M side, meaning that this is the disc that should be closest to the transmission, and that the TM side means this is the side that faces the transmission. And now pay attention to when I put this clutch disc in place. I'm holding it up so one of the notches in the disc isn't straight up in this particular scenario. I basically want it so the notches in the 2 discs are not directly lined up. And then what I'm going to do is use my clutch alignment tool and press that in once I have both discs lined up. I should be able to push in that clutch alignment tool and have that hold my clutch in place. And once that clutch is in place, you should be able to just install the rest of the pressure plate components. And again, look for the blue markings. You can see those blue markings on the left side of my clutch, so I know that I put everything back in and assembled it the way it should be. And then we're going to install our bolts that hold that pressure plate in place. Back to that star pattern that I mentioned when tightening the bolts, I'm going to work my way back and forth, trying to work this on evenly. I don't want to just torque one bolt and then have the other ones loose. You want to work them in gradually so this force is kind of applied evenly. And the good news about tightening these bolts to only 23 foot-pounds is they should be a little bit easier to do. You may have to hold on to the clutch itself a little bit to keep the engine from spinning over, but you should be able to tighten them a lot easier than it was to tighten the flywheel bolts. And once we have those bolts torqued down, we can remove our clutch alignment tool, and we should be pretty much set to go. So next we'll be on to the fun part of installing the transmission. I will be doing a transmission install video separately, so stay tuned for that, or check the video description. If I have it done, there will be a link to that transmission install video in the video description here. As always, if you have a different way of doing something or you had something that worked better for you, please leave a comment in the comment section. If I did something totally wrong, tell me down in the comment section as well. I want to keep the conversation going when it comes to EVO parts and putting things together and how people do things. I know there's not one set way, but I want to kind of bring together a source where people can go to have a conversation about it. And hopefully these videos are helping you out as you go about working on your EVO. So that's it for this video, guys. As always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks for watching.